must have been taken maybe a few months after my birth, and I'm with my mother. I remember this period because of my mother's presence, which was very enveloping, very caring. I think a lot of it may have been due to the fact that she had had a child before me who had survived just a few days and died. So I, as you can tell, was able to live a little longer. And so there was a particular pleasure and delight, I think, that she took in me in those years. Ever since I became aware of myself as a sort of independent person, I had a sense of multiple identities. I mean, I was born in Palestine. Both my parents were Palestinian, yet my father was an American citizen. So that was always a very important part of my life because I inherited an American citizenship from him without ever having been in America. My mother was Palestinian, but she was also half Lebanese. Then we were a Christian family. And when we were living in Egypt, we were unusual in that respect. So we were Palestinian, American, Christian, living in what was, even in the days of Cairo's cosmopolitan culture, we were peculiar in that we had identities that didn't fit. So in that respect, I was always slightly outside the mainstream and having different identities that I had to negotiate. I feel that my early life was divided into two parallel streams, both of them called Edward. There were two Edwards. From my earliest days, the first Edward was very much the creature of discipline, of family order, of school training. And so I felt myself really that first Edward was, it didn't really belong to me. He was the creature of all of these contexts. Then there was another Edward, the other one, that you might say the underground or subterranean Edward, which is where I felt my freedom lay. And there my imagination, my taste, my ability and interest in reading, my great love of music, the world of fantasy, the world of my sense of where I wanted to go, where I was guided by my own instincts and ambitions and desires, was very much there. And the most important thing about that, I always felt that second identity of Edward as resistant, that it was never compelled in the end by the first. Palestine in my childhood was essentially a place of fun, because my schooling was really mostly in Egypt. And we would spend intermittent periods in Palestine in the summers. And of course I felt a connection to everybody there, relatives and my own family history, which I didn't feel in Egypt, where I was, basically a foreigner. And in 48, my family, the rest of my family, my cousins, aunts, uncles, the whole extended family was driven out of Palestine. So I had nobody left. And Palestine was for me until, I would say, the late 60s, until the 67 war, was always a matter of sort of humanitarian issues, refugees, human misery, illness, destitution, despair, that had happened to unfortunate people. So that when I used to go around to the refugee places in Cairo, their homes and their clinics and so on with my aunt, I was aware that this was part of a Palestinian tragedy, but I wasn't very clear about the causes and what in fact had happened. And that really only came later when I came to America, and I got some distance from it and I started to read about it. This one must have been taken maybe a couple of years after. I must have been 13 at the time. Rather solemn and repressed young man. And then suddenly, when I was getting, older, when I was 14 and 13, went to Victoria College in Cairo, where there was a sense of animosity between us, who were all Arabs or Italians or Jews or Armenians, and the teachers who were all English. And we were made to feel inferior in school. I mean, the subject matter was English, but I felt, I don't know if everybody else did, but I certainly felt that it was a drawback, a liability in my identity that I wasn't English. That the real, idea of place and home was England. The real history was England. And all the studies I did in for example, history and geography were all European. I knew very little about the world in which I was growing up. It wasn't until later that I sort of educated myself to know more about Egypt. I grew up in Palestine and Egypt without thinking too much about it. I mean, I thought that was the place I belonged in. But I always had this American citizenship, which was reflected in my passport. And that's it. I didn't really have much connection with America. But then, when I was kicked out of school, I think it was February of 1951, my father got a lot of catalogs to schools, boarding schools in America, and he consulted with some of his friends. And in the end, a school was picked. I got in. I was admitted. And, I came. I mean, to me, it was sort of unknown. I didn't know what I was coming to. And I thought of it with some enthusiasm because I felt already in Egypt in that school I was quite, hemmed in and compromised, and I didn't like it that much. And so it seemed like a nice change, But it wasn't until I actually got here in 1951, in August of 51. We spent a week in New York. My father, my mother, and I spent a week in New York. And we got on the train, and for about 5 hours we went north. We got off at this tiny little station in the northwestern corner of Massachusetts. And we got out, me with a couple of big suitcases. A car met us at the station. We drove about a mile or two to the school. I was put in a room in a dormitory, and then my parents said, well, we have to go back to New York because there's only one train. It was the same train we came on. So they said goodbye to me, and they went back to New York, and I was alone. This is the spring of 1953, and I was on the tennis team. This is Edmund Alexander, and when I went to America, I was told to look him up because he taught it in school. He was a tennis coach and he was an English teacher. But he refused to speak Arabic to me. And I said, no, brother, I don't speak Arabic. This is America. We left the Arab world behind. Now we're Americans and we speak English.